The Volkswagen Golf is one of Volkswagen's most successful cars. It's built up a fan following. Its inception in 1974, and particularly the GTI, really kick-started a whole hot hatch generation. So we're going to look at the best mods and upgrades for your Volkswagen Golf. And this video is very general. It's looking at all the Golfs through the ages and just recommending the best mods for them. We're going to focus predominantly on the turbo versions because these give much better returns. But we're covering the gasoline petrol versions and also the diesel versions, and we're going to highlight the best mods for your project. And we're also going to flag up a few mods that, as common myths go, they don't really do an awful lot for your tuning project. We really want to just focus on the mods that make the biggest difference to your Golf. So there's a few mods to look out for that won't give you the gains that you anticipate, and they're really best avoided. So when it comes to tuning your Golf, there's two real main areas that you need to look at: the handling and the power. So the two go hand in hand. You don't just want to add loads of power to your Golf and be unable to take a corner or keep that power on the road. And you don't want the best handling Golf in the world and not have enough power to actually exploit that and enjoy that. Most of the criticisms of the early Golfs and some of the earlier generations was a lack of power. So we'll come to that toward the end of this video, but we're going to focus right now on improving the handling of your Volkswagen Golf. So the first mod that most people will think of is the suspension, and the common myth is to go really low and really hard. Now that seems to be sensible, it's what most people are doing, but in everyday driving that will cause the wheels to just skip over bumps in the road surface, and it's not really ideal. You want those tyres to be in contact with the road. And also, dropping the car substantially affects the geometry of the suspension. The camber and the toe settings, particularly under cornering loads, is dramatically altered, and you can really adversely affect your handling just by going too low. So for most Golfs, we would only recommend you drop it about 20 to 30 millimeters. There's a few exceptions there. You will find the sporty models tend to have that lower suspension already set. You'll get more in terms of performance and cornering and handling by adjusting the geometry of the suspension. So the camber of the wheels, adding a little bit of camber can actually improve the cornering. It will reduce your straight line stability and traction. So it's certainly something to balance. And also getting the toe setting just right can greatly improve the cornering of the car. So even with just a stock suspension system and a few adjustments made to that can dramatically improve the handling and cornering of your car. If you get coilovers, it includes the damper and the spring. It's a complete suspension mount itself, and the more expensive ones have got adjustments, so you can alter the ride height, which allows you to fine tune it on the car, which is a nice benefit. It allows you to set it up exactly how you want it. But also with some of them you can change the rates of spring and further tweak the handling performance to suit your driving style. So some of the earlier generations had really good lift off oversteer. It was a criticism that a lot of people threw at the car, but it made it fun to drive. They used the torsion beam rear suspension setup, so as soon as you lift off the throttle, the back tended to lift out and go wide, which would save your cornering in a lot of extreme cornering situations. But with the more recent versions, they've actually come up with a really nice independent suspension system all round. If your car is getting on and the mileage is starting to clock up, then it's time to look at the bushings. So those are the rubber mounts that are within the suspension. They connect the suspension to the actual car chassis, and as they get older the rubber perishes and it gives a little bit too much play. You might get the odd bump and vibration, and it really makes the handling a lot more soggy. So just replacing those with a new set of bushings can make a big difference to sharpen up the handling of your car. But also there's polyurethane upgrades. Now again, don't go too hard. You want a little bit of give in those mounts, so you'll be feeling every jolt through the chassis of the car as you go over the bumps and potholes in the road. But there are different grades of polyurethane mounts available. Some of the older versions you've only got the primary mounts available as upgrades. It's possible to make your own, it's possible to get them custom made, but there's nothing wrong in mixing the factory OEM rubber ones with the poly bushes and getting those on those main suspension mounting positions, and you'll get the benefit from that. So that's addressed the handling. Let's think now about the braking of the car. So generally a larger brake disc will be better at dissipating the heat, so you may need to address the brake servo and the amount of capacity the brake system has within the reservoir to cope with larger discs, because you'll also need to make that to larger pads, and the pistons will generally be different. You might even go to a 2 or 3 pot piston setup. There's quite a few upgrades out there because the Volkswagen shares its platform with Audi and Seat and Skoda, and those more sporty models, the RS, the Golf R, the Golf GTI, they all have slightly larger brake discs. So be careful when it comes to the hub sizes. The lower powered Golfs tend to have smaller hubs, and they're not as compatible with as many different brake upgrades as some of the larger engine sized ones. But if you do your research carefully, you may well be able to go to your local breakers yard and get a set of larger discs, larger pads and carriers and all the components that go with it for next to nothing, which is a lot cheaper than going out buying aftermarket parts. And then when they get worn out and need replacing, you're still using the standard Volkswagen parts, so you're not forced to go to more expensive aftermarket parts. If you didn't want to go to the expense of changing out the discs and the entire braking system, then you can make a big difference to your Golf's braking just by changing the pads. If you get a decent set of high friction pads, that will make a dramatic difference to your Golf's stopping ability. And I've used the Pagid pads with really good effect, and I really rate them. They're not that expensive, they do well. There are cheaper long life pads out there that won't do anything to enhance the braking of the Golf, and they actually, in my opinion, ruin it. So ask around. Our forum's a great place to go. If you check out our site, we've got specific articles dealing with each of the 8 generations of Volkswagen Golf with recommendations that we picked up. So all the little tips that I pick up from the comments that people leave on these videos, please let us know if you've done an upgrade that particularly works or what you found effective. And all of that goes into the articles on our site. It becomes a repository of the best practice upgrades for your Golf. So your point of contact with the road really is your tyres. So the rubber that you choose makes a big difference on the handling. Now you might think just going with high performance summer tyres is the best option, but you've got to ask the question, is it summer where I am most of the time, or is it generally wet and rainy? You need a tyre that is best suited for the majority of conditions that you drive your car in, and for most people that is a decent all-round tyre. A wet weather focused tyre will make a big difference. Here in the UK we get a lot of rain, although we haven't had very much lately, and we've got all sorts of hosepipe bans and impending doom when it comes to the water supply, but that will probably change in the winter and we'll end up with lots of rain again. So it's time to focus our tyres and get the rain spec tyres back on the Golf. So when it comes to upgrading the wheels, people often think that bigger wheels are better. They see the cars at shows with these massive 20-inch rims. They look nice, but word to the wise, they won't improve the handling of your Golf. I've always found that in everyday use, in wet conditions, on general road surfaces, the smaller rim sizes generally give a much better steering feel and improve the handling of the car. So I personally favour the 17s on most Golfs. Some of the more recent ones are better on the 18s, but you wouldn't really want to go over an 18. By the time you've decreased the profile of the tyre, you've started to restrict its flexibility in the wet, and it's going to be more subject to aquaplaning and other problems. So don't believe the myth that big alloy wheels make a difference. They're also heavier, so you're basically adding unsprung weight to the car, which adversely affects the handling. It causes tramlining, affects the general steering feel of the car. So I would strongly recommend you think twice about getting the largest alloy wheels you can. Think more carefully about your tyres and the compound chosen, the tread pattern, because that'll have a bigger bearing on the handling and improve the handling of your Golf than the other mods that you might think about. So please subscribe to our channel, because we've got lots more coming up on handling and handling upgrades, looking in depth at suspension, brakes and all the other mods that we've spoken about. But let's move on to the performance enhancements that you can make to the Golf. So the Golfs generally come with a set of petrol and diesel engines. In recent times, most of the petrol engines and diesel engines are turbocharged, and the turbo gives you a fantastic base to work from. They are seriously undertuned from the factory. On the diesel models, you can generally extract another 20 to 30% just by remapping. So remapping is where you take the ECU of the engine, which controls the fueling, air delivery, boost and all the other controls within the engine, and it optimizes the requirements that are in force at the time as you drive the car. So it's doing a constant job of trimming the fuel, altering the timing. It does a lot of work, but just altering that map it's working from can make a big difference to the power delivery of the car. So Volkswagen set the car up so it works in different environments, different countries, different fuel types, and they've chosen a very conservative, safe map. When a car rolls off the production line, it's not exactly the same as every other model that comes out. There's a big variation in the power outputs of the engines. So if you get your car taken to a custom rolling road, you can have a map set up that precisely matches your car's characteristics and gives you the best performance gains that you can actually get. So remapping a turbo car is a bit of a no-brainer. You will get substantial amounts more power, and on diesel cars you get more fuel economy. On petrol not so much. It depends on the map. You can get maps specifically set up to improve the fuel economy, but if you want more power than that, you really need to look at turbo upgrades. So there's a whole set of aftermarket turbos that can be bolted into the Golf. From the KO3, which had a safe maximum limit of about 190, you can exceed that, and I've known them to be pushed to about 220 horsepower, but by doing that you really do reduce the lifespan of the turbo. The KO3S, which was an evolution of the KO3, that was safe to about 215 horsepower and spooled up nicely from fairly low RPMs. The maximum on that is around 250 horsepower, where you start seeing the turbo life diminishing, and the bigger KO4 was fitted to the high performance derivatives of the engines, and the safe maximum for those was typically about 220 horsepower, that sort of ballpark, but I have known those to be pushed to about 350, so there's quite a bit of headroom in those KO4 turbos. On the later models we see the Honeywell turbos and a series of turbos, the IHI IS12, IS20 and the IS38, and we'll be covering those turbos in more detail because there's quite a bit you can do to swap the turbos over to the higher powered units or just replace them with a hybrid. They're often direct replacements, so in the case of a hybrid turbo they take the standard Golf turbo casing and they replace the internals with a much more sporty profile, so that allows them to have the characteristics that you want. They might increase the size of the compressor wheel, it might spool up more quickly, it might deliver a bit more top-end power, so you can precisely tailor the characteristics of the turbo to match what you want from your Golf's engine. So by the time you've increased the turbo and changed the mapping, you may well find there's some issues with the engine, and it's typically in the fuel delivery. So the fuel pump and the injectors are also worthy of consideration in any tuning project, even if it's just to give you a little bit more headroom to work in. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to have your car tuned to the max, but actually the car constantly be backing off on the power because it can't supply enough fuel. So again, a lot of the engines that the Volkswagen Group churn out have a lower power and higher power version, the 140, the 170, the 150, the 200s, and generally those higher powered engines have a larger turbo and a better fuel system. So just swapping basic models for the more advanced models components can give you a lot more headroom to work in, and that's generally a cheap, cost-effective upgrade because you can go to your local breakers yard and get a lot of these parts off the shelf. So whenever you have a turbo compressing air into an engine, you get a big build-up of heat, and the intercooler is basically a radiator that allows the compressed air that's become very hot to be exposed to the flow of air coming into the car from the ambient temperatures around, and that drops the temperature back down. Now that makes quite a significant difference to performance. We've run a few figures and looked at lots of stats, and generally if you look at the screen now, we'll just flash up the significant difference that different engine temperatures make on power. And the basic premise behind this is the fact that colder air carries more oxygen, and you need the oxygen to burn the fuel, whatever fuel it is that you're using. So if you can lower your temperature of the intake charge, it'll carry more oxygen, you'll be able to burn more fuel, and you'll make more power. Now don't think of an intercooler as a mod that adds power to your engine. It's just something there to keep the power levels as they were originally designed, and as the intercooler does its job, it actually starts to get warmer, and we call that heat soak, where the heat builds up inside the intercooler itself. So after a lot of spirited driving, the intercooler will get quite hot and it will really degrade its ability to cool that intake charge. It's fair to say that most factory cars come with very limited intercoolers. The capacity within them is barely adequate for your everyday driving. There's normally a very good argument for fitting an uprated intercooler to the factory one. It's normally much larger in size, the aftermarket ones, and they're best mounted at the front, which sometimes requires a little bit of modification to the front bumper just to make it all fit, but they sit down there quite tidily in front of the radiator in most different models. So it's certainly something worth thinking about. And if you don't do lots of spirited driving and you're not heating the intercooler up, you don't really need an aftermarket intercooler. But if you've added a bigger turbo, there's a lot more compression going on. It certainly makes sense to uprate the intercooler. And there's quite a few aftermarket options around that work really, really well. Certainly a lot better than the factory standard ones. And even within model ranges, you'll find that the performance models sometimes come with better intercoolers than the lower performance ones. The final mod that we're going to talk about really, well, there's actually two. We're going to talk about camshafts and lighter flywheels. So a lighter flywheel will alter the revving nature of the car. So the big weight on the side of the engine stores the kinetic energy, and it's what stops the engine from just instantly dipping in power when you lift off the throttle. So that's good for fuel economy. It's good for long journeys, having a fairly heavy flywheel. But if you want that sporty response and you want to do some very quick rev matching on quick changes of gear, you need a slightly lighter flywheel. Now, a lighter flywheel is not suitable for all engines, so please check the articles on our sites for recommendations as to what works, what's best. The diesel engines tended to come with a dual mass flywheel, and I would not recommend replacing those with a lighter flywheel. So the other substantial mod that you can do to any engine really is the camshaft. The camshaft controls the opening and closing of the valves on the intake and the exhaust side, and by changing the profile of that, you can make quite decent power gains just in its own right. So if you had a naturally aspirated Golf and it didn't have a turbo, the best mod you can do really is upgrade the camshaft. Now, it will probably only give you 10% more power, but as well as increasing the headline, it will increase the flexibility within the RPM range. And by choosing your cam profile carefully, you can tailor those characteristics to actually match what you actually want from your Golf. So do induction kits add power? Well, technically I have to say they do. Looking at all the dyno results, most cars will make a little bit more power, but to be honest, you are not going to notice it. You're wasting your money if you expect a power gain on a stock engine with just an induction kit added. But if you've tuned your engine and you're making a lot more power than you would have done originally, then it makes sense to upgrade the induction kit. But choose carefully, look at the volume of your standard airbox and just make sure you're not fitting a cone filter that's much smaller. If you've decreased the surface area of the filter, you've decreased the airflow. And sad to say, a lot of the cheap aftermarket air filters and induction kits that are sold actually flow pretty badly. They're just literally trying to take money off you for the concept of having a power increase and are offering a power decrease. So I really hope this overview of Golf tuning has been useful to you. Hopefully we've blown some of those common myths out of the water. Please stay tuned, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so. We've got lots of engine specific videos coming up. We've had lots of requests that are on my work list that I'm scheduling and ploughing through to cover each of those engines, and we may well have covered your engine already, so check out our other videos and please drop us a like because it really helps us to get out there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.